Hello and welcome to the Embodying Philosophy podcast. My name is Floss and I'm your host, a scholar practitioner, yoga teacher and geek for all things embodied philosophy. In modern times, we all too often think of philosophy as abstract ideas irrelevant to how we live our lives. But in ancient and pre-modern times, philosophy was a way of life. This podcast seeks to explore and revive this understanding of philosophy as a way of life, embodying philosophy as the practice of meaningful inquiry in relation to our lives as they are lived today in a pluralistic and diverse world, through engagement with ideas, practices, and traditions across time and space, from yoga to Christianity and beyond. Welcome to episode 3 of the Embodying Philosophy podcast. I am delighted to be joined by academic and mentor of mine, Dr Ankur Barua, for what is the first interview of the podcast. This interview is split into 2 episodes. In part 1, we explore the question, what is yoga? Yoga in the West is synonymous almost with physical practice, but across time and space, yoga has been a lot more. In this episode, we also address a perennial tension between the necessity of categorical thinking, that is, philosophy, theory, ideas, cosmology about yoga, and this central idea that yoga actually, as a way of being, transcends all categories. So that is really exciting. And then do stay tuned for part 2, where we talk more about yoga as a practice, as a means and spiritual discipline to address our human condition, to return to our true self, and the relationship between philosophy and ethics or virtue in this pursuit. That's a really excellent episode as well. So enjoy the conversation. Let's go. Hello and welcome. Today I am joined by Dr Ankur Barua, Senior Lecturer in Hindu Studies at the University of Cambridge's Divinity Faculty. Welcome, Ankur, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Florence, for inviting me to this podcast.
You are very, very welcome. So, Ankur, today we're going to start with a very simple yet surely profound question. And that is, what is yoga?
As I try to answer this question, let me first take a deep breath, because we can spend several days, several weeks trying to answer this question, what is yoga? So maybe I should start by saying the term yoga can have different meanings in different contexts. But for starters, here are 3 interrelated sets of ideas, practices when we hear the term yoga, especially in some traditional Hindu contexts in South Asia. So number 1, yoga as a set of ideas, concepts, what we call cosmologies. So concepts about who we are, who I truly am, where are we supposed to be going or headed towards. So that is the first set. Then number 2, yoga as a set of practices, yoga as a set of means, as a set of techniques. And number 3, yoga as a set of what we call soteriology, that is a system of liberation. And liberation from what? From our conditions of finitude. We live in a world which is shaped by impermanence, by transience, by suffering, by ignorance. Now, in present-day contexts, especially in the West, but also in many parts of India, by yoga we tend to mean a set of postures, a set of practices which may help us to deal with or even overcome anxiety, stress, various kinds of disorder. But in many living forms of Hinduism, in pre-modern South Asia, India, and even today in many parts of Hinduism, yoga is this complete package, a set of ideas, set of concepts about who I am, why am I here, a set of tools, a set of practices which are oriented towards the third dimension, liberation from our conditions of imperfection. Now, let me also in the same breath, tell you a little bit about the word yoga itself. So the word yoga, we can literally translate it as yoking, as a form of joining. And depending on the text, depending on the tradition, depending on the teacher, it can have a range of meanings such as union. It could even mean a form of disunion. It can mean combination. It can mean junction. It can mean restraining. It can mean harnessing. And that is already to begin to point you towards the range of meanings of yoga. So let's simply say this, that in many forms of Hinduism, yoga is this recovery of one's true nature. So we have forgotten who we truly are, and we have moved away from our deep foundation. So this process of, it's a very difficult, even maybe painful initially, process of recovery or retrieval of my true nature through the cultivation of certain virtues or dispositions such as steadfastness, such as inner equilibrium, such as meditative or contemplative stability. Let me pause there by saying that is my opening remark regarding the very difficult question, what is yoga? And maybe you can pick up certain aspects of what I've said just now, and I can push them forward.
Well, there's certainly a lot there, so I thank you for that excellent contribution and opening to our conversation, Ankur. And it's really interesting you distinguish between these three understandings or ways of thinking about yoga, the ideas, the practices, and in a broader sociological sense, being about salvation, about the ultimate goals of life. Now, of course, they're interconnected, right?
As I said, these are three different perspectives on yoga, which are at some level interrelated. But different people, for different kinds of reasons, may choose to focus on one and not the other two. So, for example, I could be a philosopher or a text-based scholar of a certain type who says, I do not myself practice yoga, and I'm not very interested about what yoga will do to me regarding liberating me, but I just want to read the Sanskrit text and figure out the argument. Is the argument consistent? Suppose if I do that, then I'm focusing on the first aspect. Or suppose I may say, yoga helps me to meditate, to feel calm and peaceful after a very stressful day. On the weekend, I set aside a few hours. I'm not too interested about what is that concept in that Sanskrit commentary. I'm not too interested about becoming liberated from conditions of impermanence, as I put it. I'm interested in yoga as a tool, as a mechanism that helps me to cope with the different kinds of storms and stresses of everyday life. Right, so that's what I meant when I said that these are three perspectives which are interrelated in some complete packages out there. But different people, if they wish to, they may focus on one or the other, and they do.
Yeah. No, that's so interesting, because I think for many of us today in the modern Western world, yoga is synonymous with posture, asana, stretching even. But historically, maybe you could tell us a little bit about yoga, because part of the intention, I guess, of this podcast is that philosophy is the history of philosophy, and that all practices and ideas are historically and socially situated. And by understanding them in that context, it can help us think about them today. So what can you tell us about yoga? How old is yoga?
Yeah, so regarding precisely how old is yoga, again, that is one of those big billion-dollar questions people have different views about. But let's simply say the practices, the cosmologies, the ideas, the concepts that we today connect with yoga can be traced back to certain texts, such as the Yoga Sutra, which is usually dated at about 300 CE, that is the 3rd century of the Common Era. Now, that does not mean that these ideas are turning up for the first time in the 3rd century of the Common Era. It simply means that this is the time frame when these ideas are being consolidated, when they are being set down, they are being codified. So we can trace back ideas relating to breath control, self-control, self-inquiry, meditative inquiry, all the way back to the Upanishads. Some people may even trace it back to the times of the Vedas. But the Yoga Sutra gives us a good point of departure. We can say, well, these ideas, cosmologies, practices are at least as old as the 3rd century or the 2nd century of the Common Era. Now, the Yoga Sutra, and these are a set of aphorisms called sutras, which cannot be understood without a commentary. And that text, the Yoga Sutra, is attributed to a figure called Patanjali. And there is a commentary on it called the Yoga Bhashya, which is attributed to a figure called Vyasa. Not much is known about these figures, who they were, or their historicity. Now, in the light of that response, let me again give you 3 perspectives on how we may look at yoga. So one is what I would like to call baseline yoga. And by baseline yoga, I mean this: a set of practices which help us to develop a form of mental equilibrium, a form of mental stability. So let's say in my life, I have met many people who do not directly practice yoga, but in whose presence I have felt that they embody a form of composure, they embody a form of serenity, tranquility. And this is what I'm calling baseline yoga. It may be the case that they practice certain forms of meditative contemplation drawn from Christian or Islamic or Jewish practices. Or it may be that these are Hindus who do not themselves practice yoga, but they have picked up certain forms of meditative calmness from their wider environment. So this is what I'm calling baseline yoga. Then there is a form of yoga which I would like to call a tradition-rooted yoga, or if you want, metaphysically heavy yoga. So when we look at certain Hindu theologians or philosophers or commentators, say Shankara, the 8th century, Ramanuja, the 11th century, and there's a whole spectrum of them, they locate yoga in their theological worldviews. So yoga is this form of spiritual inquiry, spiritual mechanism that leads us towards liberation. And we would use the language of bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotional love, the yoga of self-inquiry, jnana yoga, karma yoga, the yoga of action, moral action, ritual action. And again, these different styles of yoga, bhakti yoga, karma yoga, jnana yoga, are interrelated and interwoven in different ways. And there are big philosophical debates about which yoga has the priority. Is it primarily bhakti yoga? Is it primarily A or B or C? And that is what I mean by tradition-heavy yoga.
I'll pause you there. Could you tell us what these terms mean for those who don't know?
Yeah.
Jhana, karma, bhakti.
Yes. So again, to give you one-line definitions, bhakti is this cultivation of devotional attachment, devotional love towards a personal God. And in a Hindu context, we are talking about a deity like Vishnu or Shiva or Rama and so on. Jnana yoga or jnana yoga is this meditative cultivation of self-inquiry. Who am I truly? Am I just my physical body, which is corporeal, mutable, and so on? Or am I this deep, imperishable self beyond change, beyond transmutation? Then karma is a term that we use in English all the time. So karma is action, moral action, ritual action. So a certain practice of performing action that gives us meditative stability. So that is karma yoga. So the debate that I was pointing to is about which yoga is predominant then. Which yoga is the primary tool that we should be developing? Is it inquiry? Is it action? Is it devotional love? And all this is what I'm calling tradition-rooted yoga. Now, so the first style of yoga is baseline yoga. You may have never even heard the word yoga and may be doing unself-consciously yoga, which is helping you to be calm and composed. And then there is this tradition-heavy yoga. And in between, there's a whole spectrum of different combinations and permutations. Say, many Hindus who I know, they may do a certain type of yoga, although they have not received proper initiation or diksha into a particular lineage. So they have picked up some of the languages of yoga from their wider cultural atmosphere, and they are putting together different bits and pieces in configuring their own type of yoga. So that's what I mean by yoga somewhere in between, a tradition-rooted yoga and a baseline yoga, and yoga somewhere in between. Mm-hmm. So when we start looking at yoga in different parts of India, you'll find this whole spectrum. And to make things even more complicated, once yoga starts migrating to Western locations from, say, 1890 onwards, I say 1890, only because, or primarily because, the figure who is credited with having translated or brought yoga to Western shores is a figure called Swami Vivekananda. he started talking about yoga as the science of the mind, or the science of the soul, or the science of the self. And he was using the term science because for many Victorians, the term science had this language of prestige. And thereafter, as we may know, from the 1960s onwards, 80s onwards, different founders of modern yoga, as they are called, people like B.K.S. Iyengar and various other figures, have reworked, recalibrated what I've called tradition-rooted yoga, and transported it to many Western locations. Now we can do yoga in Boston, in Berlin, in Brisbane, and Birmingham. Right. So that is just a kind of a quick overview of the whole spectrum, the whole landscape of different meanings of yoga. Right. So you can be in a lineage and do a particular type of yoga laid down by a figure, by a guru like Ramanuja. You can be doing yoga without even realizing you are doing yoga, as I'm putting it, and you can be somewhere in between.
Now, can you be doing what you think is yoga, but it's not actually yoga? Because I know many people today are concerned that the yoga that they're doing is not real or not authentic. I mean, that's part of my own,
yes.
I wanted to find that more authentic yoga.
Yes. I mean, in my response to the previous question, I used the term translation. So as we know, translation is both a promise and a peril. Translation is a promise because it helps you to understand a different worldview. And it is a peril because of these questions of authenticity. Right. So I would say the prior question we should be asking is who is the judge of this type of authenticity? I mean, who's going to assess it and say, okay, I hereby declare this form of yoga you are carrying out or practicing in this suburb of Bristol is not authentic. And who is this person who will make this claim? Well, number one, you can be a guru of one of these traditional forms of yoga, which can be dated back to the 3rd century of the Common Era, and say, what I see there cannot be situated within the universe of the Yoga Sutra. So that's one way of doing it. Another way could be, I have received a particular initiation or a diksha from a guru in Rishikesh, and what I'm saying here in Bristol again does not conform to that practice. So I do not mean to say there is no way to perform, there is no way to offer these kinds of assessments. There are ways, and we will have to lay down these ground rules that yoga is properly the real thing if it conforms to that template. And there are different templates, right? As I've been telling you, even in the traditions, there is no one template called only Bhakti Yoga. There is also Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga, and you have to think about how to interrelate the other two. So it is a bit of an open, ongoing dialogue, debate, discussion, even in the pre-modern Hindu contexts. I mean, even before we start talking about Western migrations or translations of yoga.
So you're saying that while today people question the authenticity of modern yoga, this isn't necessarily a new development, but actually these debates have been going on for a long time historically between these different schools. Because I think a lot of what people don't recognize is the diversity and perspectives on yoga and practices of yoga in the pre-modern period, right? I mean, maybe you could say something about going back to the first question, this distinction between the ideas, the practices and the soteriology. And you said different people might focus on different aspects. For example, Patanjali, who supposedly composed the Yoga Sutra, was he a yogi? We assume he was, but maybe he was more of a scholar, more of a pandit.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, we don't know much about these figures, and many of these texts are attributed to certain scholars, certain commentators, certain mystics, certain sages. If you and I could somehow come up with a time travel machine, how much we would love to go back in time and meet the most exalted Mr. Patanjali. We are delighted to make we're delighted to meet you. And we have all these questions. We have come from the future. And I often use that image of a time travel mission in my lectures and supervisions, because so many questions about what was happening in pre-modern South Asia under the label of what we call Hinduism, we often don't really know, because people in those days, when they wrote a book or when they were transmitting a certain tradition, did not write a foreword or a preface saying, I hereby declare that I am Patanjali and I am so-and-so. I have written this book because I had a wonderful conversation with Florence, which made me think like this. All we have are some of these aphorisms, and as I said, without a commentary you cannot understand an aphorism because it is very cryptic, it is very short. Therefore, you're right. I mean, I would say possibly a helpful way to think of yoga 2,000 years ago is to think of it as a complete package. A package with ideas about the self, notions of reality, the meaning of life, all of this, I mean ideas, and certain practices which are deeply interrelated with these ideas. So method, practice on the one hand, and idea, cosmology on the other hand are deeply interwoven. And this whole package is, as I said, rooted in these technologies of the self, as they call them, and that's a very heavy phrase, which simply means certain mechanisms, certain tools to help us regain, recover, retrieve our true essence, our true nature. Who are we? What am I? Why am I here? Which way am I headed towards? All these grand questions of humanity, which turn up in many other forms of Hinduism and many other religious traditions. We see in the 51, in the many, sorry, not the 51, in the many sutras of the Yoga Sutra. Some of them are more directed towards questions of reality, what is there. Some of them are directed towards questions of how may I live a good life. What is the nature of human well-being, human flourishing? Some questions are directed towards, some of the sutras are directed towards questions of how do I know what I know? Do I really understand reality properly? So as you can see, questions of who am I, questions of what there is, questions of how may I get to know what there is, are all interwoven dimensions of one tapestry. If you read the Yoga Sutra from page 1 to page 20, right?
Cool. So a few things have come up, and one thing I'm curious about when we're talking about if we were to have a template of authenticity, well, a lot of people feel that yoga comes from a certain place. Is yoga Indian?
Yeah. So if we use the term Indian in a straightforward historical geographical sense to mean that landmass we call South Asia, then yes, in that straightforward historical sense, yoga is Indian. And just to go back to a point I was making earlier, when I said yoga is at least as old as 300 CE, 200 CE. Now here is a text I'm going to read out from an Upanishad, and the Upanishads are again variously dated, and I can't tell you exactly when this particular text was recited or composed for the first time, but let's say 400 BCE, so before the Common Era. And this is a text from an Upanishad which says, this is the rule for achieving this oneness or unity. And it talks about a six-fold yoga, not an eightfold yoga, but a six-fold yoga. And it uses these big terms that we are familiar with, or we would be familiar with if we practice yoga: pranayama, pratyahara, dhyana, dharana, tarka, and samadhi. And every interpretation, every translation is an interpretation, so it is very difficult to translate these words. But for our purposes, let's simply say these are the six means. So control of the breath, withdrawal of the senses, meditation, concentration, contemplative inquiry, that is tarka, and the most difficult one, samadhi. Samadhi is a term that really cannot be translated, but let's say samadhi is sometimes translated as absorption, and it's not a very happy translation, but let me just say that is what samadhi is. So if we say that a concept or a practice is rooted in the Upanishads, and if it is so, then it is Indian, then yoga is Indian.
And earlier you were saying, however, that when you described this idea of baseline yoga, this kind of way of being in the world, that some people's energy, they may not know what yoga is or means or practice anything that we associate with yoga in modernity today, but they nonetheless have this meditative calmness, I think you called it, which is somewhat yogic, or at least aligns with those ideas that are found in those ancient Indian texts. And they may be Muslim or Christian or
even Hindu, who do not consciously practice yoga in the sense that they have received initiation from a particular guru and are following a particular mechanism of yoga.
So does that mean that other religious traditions have their own kind of yogas within them?
So if we take yoga to mean that particular word which turns up in these texts such as the Upanishad and Bhagavad Gita, then maybe not that yoga, but if we translate yoga a bit loosely in this baseline term as the cultivation, the practice of meditative equipoise, contemplative stability, meditative inquiry, questions about who am I, what is the nature of the divine reality, the relation between humanity and the cosmos. These kinds of yoga are these types of yoga. They can migrate across these religious borderlines much more readily. Then what? Then if I say to you, by yoga, I mean this particular bhakti yoga, and by bhakti yoga, I mean this particular worship of the god Vishnu. Now, of course, that is not Christian. But if I redefine yoga in this more baseline sense, as whatever helps you to develop meditative calmness, and that yoga, that concept of yoga is not only found in the Upanishads. It can be found in different types of mystical practices in medieval Christianity. Different forms of Sufism will have that kind of breath control, mind control. I mean, talking about Sufism, in pre-modern South Asia, there were certain translations across Sufi and yoga borderlines. So historically even, some of the Sufi masters, they would sometimes rework the language of yogic, meditative breath control, mind control. But that is just a historical point. I mean, even without going into that historical pathway, purely at the level of translation, if you talk about yoga as a form of mind control, you don't necessarily have to be Hindu to practice mind control. Right?
So I guess it goes back to the fact that yoga is one word, but it represents so much and it can be understood in so many different ways, and it's easy to say, oh, that's not yoga, that is yoga, but we've really got to think actually yoga is multifaceted, and is it a way of being, is it a specific practice, is it a specific set of ideas, is it a specific tradition, and whichever definition we choose for that moment, it will have different consequences for kind of what yoga is.
And that's why I started this whole line of inquiry with a deep breath.
Yes.
Because there's so much can be said in answer to the seemingly simple question, what is yoga? I mean, am I answering the question in terms of experience, in terms of a text, in terms of history, in terms of cultural translation?
And I think this is one of the potential issues we have at least in modern yoga communities and online in the West today. So no breaths are taken. There's tension, stress, and oh, yoga, you're not doing yoga right. Oh, you're ruining yoga.
I mean, that is deeply ironical, is it not? I mean, yoga is supposed to make you feel calm and peaceful and not make you feel deeply disturbed about am I doing yoga? The more you keep on asking this question, is it really yoga? Is it really yoga? You are not doing yoga. Because yoga is supposed to promote a lightness of being, a lightness with categories, with classifications. If you're so anxious about, is it the right category of yoga, that is deeply un-yogic. Because we are
wise words.
Because we are solidifying a certain category, whereas part of the process of yoga is not to remove all categories, but to try to deal with categories with a certain lightness. So we need concepts as a roadmap, as navigation tools, but a roadmap is not a territory. So if the only reason why we are doing yoga is because, only this yoga found in the suburb of Birmingham is the real yoga, and not that new start guru who has come up in this suburb of London, and you start a massive tirade or a war of words about what is authentic, what is not authentic. These are debates which are actually taking us away from yoga as understood by who? Not by me, but by the Yoga Sutra and various commentators on the Yoga Sutra. They would certainly not advise this kind of anxiety over categories.
So do you think there's a point to studying yoga philosophy then, if we don't want to become overly anxious about categories, ideas, abstractions, concepts.
Yes, I mean,
how do we balance the theory and the practice?
Yeah, well, I mean, to that question, I mean, I don't have a one-line answer, because how do we balance theory and practice, not just with respect to yoga, but with respect to anything? That question cannot have a one-line answer. It is for you to try it out, and we will see. And we would have different types of assessments about who is more skillful in balancing them, in mediating them. I may think that, okay, your yoga is a bit too theory heavy, it's not to my liking, I need more practice. Whereas I may very well think, oh, that yoga is too practice heavy, give me a little bit more of theory. Now, who is right and who is wrong? Well, you tell me. We need to have a conversation.
Yeah. And I guess that kind of comes back to the distinction between those different paths that you talked about, jhana, the path of knowledge, bhakti, the path of devotion, karma, the path of action without too much attachment.
Yes.
And Raja. What would you describe Raja as?
Yeah, so again, like Raja Yoga has, I mean, there are different ways of situating Raja Yoga on the spectrum. Some people will say it is the greatest yoga, it's the king yoga, and some people will subsume Raja Yoga under one of these forms. So let's say those people who go with Raja Yoga as a distinctive path, they will say Raja Yoga is the summit, is the spiritual summit, which goes beyond this particular triad of bhakti, jnana, and karma. But again, don't worry too much about these classifications, is what I'm saying. I mean, so let's put it this way. I mean, people who have really developed a type of yogic stability, they would have done it without any of these labels. I mean, which is not to say that these labels are not useful. They are extremely useful in laying down a pathway, giving you pointers, giving you a graduated mechanism. But if the only thing that I think of when I wake up in the morning, okay, right now, is it Raja I'm doing or karma? Or when I go to sleep, okay, did I do more of bhakti or did I do more of jnana? That is again to reify these categories, make these concepts into big boxes, into big categories.
Yet tradition and ideas are important, because earlier you talked about this kind of relationality between practice and ideas or cosmology as this complete package, and both being rooted in technologies of self. I love this phrase. I think it's a Foucauldian
I think ultimately comes from critical theory, like technology of the self. So just as we have a technology for making a car, making an engine, which helps us to go from point A to B, likewise we have a technology which will help us to retrieve the self, retrieve the deep self from its immersion in worldliness. So, because of all kinds of anxieties and concerns, I do not have time to reflect on who am I, why am I here. So a technology of the self will help me to dig deeper into my everyday worldliness and try to answer these very difficult questions. So that's the technology of the self.
Yeah. And it's also a kind of, I know Gavin Flood's in the Tantric Body, he talks a lot about the role of tradition and text in the development of the subject, the yogic subject, in the context of tradition. So we do need, I think at any point in time, the practice, the ideas.
Yes, I agree. Yeah. I mean, a while ago, I may have used this phrase. If I did not, I'm using it now. The phrase that I may have used is a certain lightness with respect to categories. I did not say categories do not exist, but we have to handle them with a certain lightness. Not always asking the question, what category is it now? What category is it tomorrow? What category was it yesterday? Because that kind of categorical thinking is part of the deconstruction or the dismantling of this kind of thinking with categories. It's part of the journey of yoga. It's not the only thing that yoga is doing. But if I get mentally fixated on this category, this classification, what yoga is supposed to promote on many understandings of yoga is a certain lightness or way of being in the world.
So we've come to the end of part 1 of this interview with Dr. Ankur Barua. So far we've explored different paths of yoga, different understandings or ways to think about what yoga is, and ultimately come to the conclusion that yoga in many ways signifies a way of being in the world, in which categories might begin to become less important. They help us get there, but they are not an end in themselves. In episode 4 of the Embodying Philosophy podcast, you can hear the rest of me and Ankur's conversation, and this is one you do not want to miss. We explore the human condition and yoga as a means to help us in our lives, which are filled with fragmentation and separation from our true self. We also explore a really fascinating topic, which is the relationship between philosophy or metaphysics and ethics or morality, virtuous cycles whereby philosophy informs ethics, informs action. And I think this is really relevant in how we think about embodied philosophy. See you soon. Bye-bye.